I'm thrilled to have partners locally, nationally, and across the globe to be part of this presentation today. RJCA's Restorative Justice Community Action, we became part of the Trust Network when it was started in 2020, I believe, and nationally, and we've been meeting locally with some organizations in Minnesota, Peace Building Leadership Academy and Nonviolent Peaceforce since 2020, and so we're excited to bring this conversation today. We'll talk a little bit more about opportunities at the end, but I don't want to delay with my talking, but get to our speakers. Please note that this is actually an hour-long presentation, 60 minutes. Just to clarify that, we are going to begin with introductions, and then there's going to be a poll being taken. And then following up with a panel discussion between Prabha and Tiffany. We are going to close the chat pretty soon here, as soon as, and then we'll open it up again when we're ready to take questions for our speakers. So first of all, I would like to introduce Tiffany Easthom from Nonviolent Peaceforce, and thank her for being here, calling in from Togo. So again, if there's if one of us drops off because of internet issues, we'll pop back on, and one of us will keep filling the space with our voices. And then Prabha Sankaranarayan. Sorry, I had it close. Anyway, so if you would like, Tiffany, could you please introduce yourself to our group?
Sure. Thank you, Cynthia. Thanks, everybody. It's lovely to be here with some folks, some old friends, and some new names and faces. My name's Tiffany Easthom. I'm the Executive Director for Nonviolent Peaceforce. And just to get us started, for those of you who are not part of the old friends group, we'll just do a little intro into what Nonviolent Peaceforce does in the world. And by doing that, I'm just going to share my screen for a quick minute. Give you just a little. There we go. Everybody can see that okay? I can't see you, so somebody say yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Perfect, thanks. So Nonviolent Peaceforce is a international organization or non-governmental organization, and we work. Overarching goal is to increase the safety and security for civilians impacted by violence, by violent conflict, and by the impact of violence. We have been around for 22 years doing this kind of work, and we are currently working in 9 different countries. So we've got programming in Asia. So we work in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Myanmar. We have a country program in Iraq. We're in South Sudan, and we are just getting our newest program up and running in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have a country program in Ukraine, and for what impacts many of you on the call, or is relevant to more close to home for you, we also have programming teams in the United States and California, Minnesota, and New York. The work that we do is called Unarmed Civilian Protection, which is just an acronym, just a title. We call it UCP for short. And it's really a civilian-led, unarmed, organized approach that draws from the practices and values of activated or organized nonviolence to work together to reduce violence and increase the safety and security of all of us who are impacted by violence. We organize ourselves, orienting towards and with and through, starting from those who are most impacted by violence. And our goal is really to build out as much space, safe space around folks. So at the very least, people can live as normal of a life as they can, as they want to, that it's not interrupted by violence. And even better yet, if people are so inspired and have the energy and feel safe enough to do so, there's enough safe space within which that they can work on building the peace, working for justice and accountability in the way that is meaningful for them in their country. The way we practice UCP, those are really different places I just listed, and it's really adapted and flexible and tailored to the locations that and the needs of the communities that we're in service of. So even within one country, what it looks like in New York and California and Minnesota in and of itself is all coming from the same foundational toolbox, and then really adapted to what the real communities that we're in service of are calling from. The easiest to think about this from a organizational thinking is we are working to protect. So that's kind of the unique value add of the piece of work that we do, in as much as we really are oriented towards and have a strong pillar of our work that is really about preventing violence in the first place. So everything from ideally deterring violence from happening, de-escalation, those pieces of work, shuttle diplomacy, that type of way of working together, to utilizing various tools and strategies to protect people who are facing imminent threats to their physical security. So that's the protect element. So really stopping violence in the moment, or at least mitigating the impact of it. Building is that big block in the middle, supporting local civil society organizations, individuals, formal, informal groups, to really structure. Most of you on this call, if not everybody on this call, is part of building and really building up that infrastructure for peace. So looking at alternatives to force, or the threat of force as our go-to tool for dealing with what is inevitable, which is conflict. We're always going to be in conflict in some way and have differences, but violence certainly does not need to be part of that. And then ultimately to advocate. And so this is taking what we learn, what we know, how to amplify and uplift the voices of those who have the least amount of access to power, those who are most impacted by violence, and support them to get their voices and their requests and their asks higher upstream, as we would say, and to be able to advocate for policy change everywhere from within the United Nations system, the international humanitarian response system, and with member state governments, everything from work that's done in DC and other capitals around the world. Just to wrap it up, this is just our last slide, so people wonder what it actually looks like. These are the types of activities our teams around the world are engaged in. So it's the toolkit, and it's really mix and match. That's a really important piece of the way that we operate, is being very flexible and adaptable, and being able to shift, because working in places that are politically dynamic, where there's a lot of active conflict or there's a lot of tension, we can see that what happens day over day, week over week, can really shift and focus. So we may go back and forth between really working on what you see at the top of the wheel around the proactive engagement, protective accompaniment. Those are the tools, interpositioning, that we use for the immediate reaction, the immediate addressing violence, the threats of violence people are facing, or active violence, to things that are the longer term, and digging into those root causes and working on building out those infrastructures for peace. And then the points in between, which is about sort of trying to hold that space as we collectively crack it open. So let me leave it here, so we don't do a long engagement, and we will hand it back over as soon as I can end that show and stop the show.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Thank you, Cynthia, for this invitation. I am delighted to be having this opportunity to do a couple of things. First, to talk about the work that we're doing in the US, and as importantly, to have a chance to speak with Tiffany again. It's been a while. Nonviolent Peaceforce and Mediators Beyond Borders worked together when our team was in South Sudan, one of the many countries that Nonviolent Peaceforce has been active. And in addition to Tiffany, one of my mentors has been one of the founders of NP. Mel is one of the first people I call when I have a question or an ethical dilemma. He's been an extraordinary mentor for many of us, I know, and not just for me. So with that, my name is Prabha Sankaranarayan. Thank you for this opportunity to be in conversation with Tiffany and with all of you, hopefully, to talk about what may not be very unique to the US. And that's the hope that we engage in this conversation about. So when Cynthia said, I really want those of us who are working at the community level and at the national level to understand that two things. One, we are not immune to the forces that are affecting us globally, as over 55 countries go to the polls this year, have gone to the polls this year, are going to the polls this year. And just as importantly, that we can overcome this. And I thought that was a compelling reason to have this conversation, that we pay attention to what we share with countries around the world, and at the same time focus on what is uniquely relevant and prevalent in the US context, as many of you who are working deep in community can attest to. So I speak both as the CEO of Mediators Beyond Borders International, and at present, for this presentation, I really want to focus on the role of the Trust Network and our work in the US as a part of the collaboration of amazing organizations that came together in order to address the threats to political violence, to the democracy. And we started in 2020. Now, the Trust Network itself was initiated very specifically with the goal of understanding how we can all benefit from a national social cohesion. And there's Janet from Pennsylvania. No, not from Pennsylvania, I'm sorry. How we can benefit from a national social cohesion and security architecture, with the idea that we can collaborate locally and nationally and learn from what we have seen around the world. So the conveners of the Trust Network are the National Association for Community Mediation, and Cynthia's organization in Minneapolis is one of the centers that is a local convening center, about one amongst 35 nationally. And I know that the ED, the director of the National Association for Community Mediation, is here, DG Mon. You'll see him. He might wave when we are not spotlighting anyone. And the University of Massachusetts Center for Peacebuilding, Democracy, and Development. And the goal of the Trust Network was to both set up an early warning system, early response, early warning system, as well as to build the connection between national and local efforts, with an opportunity to learn from the global efforts. And so this is what we have been doing for the last 4 years. And I am really want to mention that what we are is a network of networks. So while there are organizations who are part of the stakeholder group of the Trust Network, what is really unique to the US context is the robust networks within each of these sectors. This is the structural reform actors, those working on political reform, ranked choice voting, open primaries, redistricting, money in politics, those kinds of issues. Those working as peace builders, bridge builders, mappers, and analysts, the judicial, those working through our judiciary, as well as the nonviolent civil resistance movements in this country. And so when we started this, it was with the idea that all of these kinds of different groups would be a part of our network. So one of the reasons we started the Trust Network was because of what you told us. So I'm going to ask Dr. Jennifer Grubbs at this time to put a link in the chat. Jennifer is our National Strategic Advisor. We are fortunate to have her. She joined us this year, and she's an anthropologist and amazing at being able to hold this group together for us today. So Jennifer, if you wouldn't mind, here is the link in the chat. Fill out this form. We're going to take a couple of minutes for you to fill this form out. We're asking you to go to this Google form. It's a quick poll. It's a pulse check, as it were, of what 36 of you who are present, besides the 4 of us who are hosting here, think about the dynamics in the United States? Are you all able to access it? You can unmute and say no if you cannot.
We have one response, so that is a sign that it is accessible.
One person is successful. Okay. Do you all remember 4 years ago when we needed to give all these instructions in such detail? And we now take them for granted, don't we? And we are able to do things like having Tiffany from Togo be amongst us, from Pittsburgh and Delaware and Detroit and Minneapolis and Louisville and all these other places. Salt Lake City, I see. Springfield, Illinois, San Diego.
There's a Canada, Ontario.
Ireland. Okay, I know Jennifer's watching the poll to see if we're getting the responses.
We're at 31 responses already.
Fabulous. Hey. Do you want to share the results with us, Jennifer, please? Great. Thank you. We raise these dynamics in this poll, and I will tell you that when we did this 4 years ago, it looked just a little bit different. But what was shocking and what led to DG Mon and I being convinced that we really needed to start this national early warning, early response platform was this result. At that time, more than 75% of the people who took this poll described these dynamics in the US as prevalent. I see that there have been shifts now, given this is a different group. But more importantly, this is what has been used in many different parts of the world by a variety of people, including our Deputy Director for Mass Atrocities and Genocide Prevention, Alice Nduritu, who serves at the United Nations. And I asked for this poll partly to also orient Tiffany's presentation and maybe her remarks about what she sees in relation to countries in which Nonviolent Peaceforce has worked and what those dynamics might be indicative of us, for all of us here. So Tiffany, I'll hand this over to you.
Thanks, Prabha. And we're hoping to have a bit of a conversation back and forth, sort of sharing observations and experiences, I guess, sort of trying to sort of paint a picture and help us all sort of see ourselves in each other. When we talk about particularly, the issues related to the influence of political moments like elections, the world looks to a place like the US as sort of the cornerstone of democracy and thinking, this is the place to be and the place to model ourselves after. And Certainly in this group, I mean, I think people are well alert and aware to some of the concerns and considerations around the fragility that democracy is something we have to work for every day. It's not a given. Let me just start from a place and really drawing from that poll. I just got back from the US. Actually, somebody's mentioned that I'm in Togo. I'm based in West Africa right now. But I just spent 3 weeks visiting our various locations for NP in the US and saw some of you on the call recently as a part of that. And I spent some time in North Minneapolis with our team there and was walking around in the part of the city that the team really works on, meeting members of the community that they're in service of. And what I started to notice were some really physical signs. I noticed things like houses that were boarded up, lots of broken windows, sort of plywood nailed into buildings to close up their windows, or abandoned houses. So, you know, things were overgrown and given up. Businesses that had been once been there and had left, had gone away. There'd been signs of things breaking down. The people that we were speaking to were talking about things like there was no longer a grocery store in the neighborhood. Colleagues in the office said it was difficult to get food delivered, like if they wanted to order lunch, to get food delivered to the office because those who were delivering food felt nervous and unsafe to come into that neighborhood. So they were choosing not to deliver a hamburger or a pizza or whatever they'd ordered online. You know, we could hear, you know, more than once in the week that I was there was incidents of gunfire and so on and so forth. And what really struck me is I've spent a lot of time in countries that are in what is internationally recognized armed conflict, war zones, to be frank about it. And I thought, you know what, a lot of this looks similar. This is the impact of long-term violence. Long-term instability is, what does it do? It interrupts economic development. It interrupts educational development. Lots of people not going to school for a variety of reasons, whether it's as overt as being physically unsafe in the physical school or getting to and from school, to sort of the less obvious but very impactful instability, trauma, violence in the homes that creates an untenable environment to be able to do that. It is so, yeah, economic development, people being really afraid, being really polarized, being scared of each other, and withdrawing into sort of smaller identity groups, which is often very common as we get very scared. We get closer and closer to sort of primal and primary identities that we see and where we think we're going to, the proliferation of weapons. The US, of course, is famous for having more weapons than people. And I thought, oh, this is so interesting. A little snapshot from having dropped in here to see this and to see what's missing is when you have an international armed conflict, you actually have the benefit of international humanitarian law, and the whole international humanitarian system will move in. So civilians who are caught up in situations like that, when a war breaks out, as awful as the situation is, there is a globally agreed upon approach about how to support civilians. And funding comes through from all over the world. There's support systems, there's coordination mechanisms, and there's a specific body of law that goes into protecting the civilians in those situations. And in a situation like this, where you have the impact, you're seeing the impact of long-term instability, long-term exposure to violence, you don't have the benefit of those things. And I thought it really struck me quite profoundly to see what that meant and what does that mean. And so thinking of the work that the Trust Network and all the member organizations that are doing to try and work within that space, and how similar and familiar that feels to the work that NP does in active conflict zones like Ukraine and Iraq and other locations that we've been, Sudan, that we've been working in for many, many years.
So Tiffany, as you're coming in, I know you're Canadian, you're not completely a visitor to the North American context. As you come in and look at some of these factors, I wonder if you can say a little bit about what is the perception from the outside? What are the news reports of? What is the outsider's perception of what's going on here, even as you're seeing the familiarity and similarity between what you've seen in other countries that are actively at war and a country that doesn't recognize that, even though the number of deaths per day might be comparable?
Yes, I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, if we think about media and headlines, I mean, the media, social media or formal media, I mean, we're very attracted to bad news stories. And so we see a lot of that. But certainly there is, I think, an increasing awareness and concern for sort of what is turning into a shifting global geopolitical power structures and power dynamics. And the US has been the cornerstone of sort of the rights-based, rules-based global world order for the last 70 years. And I think there's this sort of recognition that what feels like and what is being presented as sort of a shaky at home, sort of in the domestic field, where within the US, some of those long-standing sort of rules-based order approaches are being challenged. And because there's an increasing report of all types of violence, civilian to civilian, state to civilian, so on and so forth. I think that it is really challenging perceptions about, even so when the US goes out and talks about democracy, there's less credibility that comes in behind there because people are really worried. Said, well, your kids are not safe in school. Our kids can go to school here in Togo and they're not going to get shot. But what we understand is it's not safe for children to go to school in the US. So that reduces the ability to have a conversation where democracy is the leading edge of that conversation, because democracy brings safety and stability for communities and development and so on and so forth. So it's really shifting the way we all see each other.
I think when I look at the results of the polls, amongst the factors that you see rated by the most number of our participants are things like increased poverty levels, racial and ethnic tensions, hate speech. There's a huge increase in the use of violent language. When you look at the increase in the use of violent language and increasing polarization, these are all terms that those of us who've been working in the peace building and bridge building communities in the US have been using a lot of. And our language, I've noticed over the last 4 or 5 years, has changed in a way that is creating a bit of a collective narrative. So there is a little bit more of a shared understanding of what some of these things mean, which leads me to what you have seen in the countries in which you have worked as effective strategies, given these, destabilizing factors, these polarizing dynamics, and the heavy militarization and securitization of so much of our response. What have you seen? What can you say, Tiffany, about some of the strategies that you have found to be effective?
Yeah, I mean, well, the news is nerve-wracking, and in every sort of change situation, there's opportunity, and sort of it correlates with what we see in the countries that we work in, including the U.S. is, asymmetrical power relationships are at the core of normalized violence. So, a small group of people holds a majority amount of power. And what we see is then sort of in decreasing, if we can imagine a curve, right? Decreasing representation and down to the group that has the least access to power will always have the biggest brunt of violence. So strategies that we are finding that are most impactful for sustainable change, for really starting to change a norm around normalized, accepted levels of violence, everything from interpersonal to intra-communal, intra-family, because it leaks all the way through, is really focusing on how do we collectively help each other to remove the barriers that are allowing that asymmetrical power relationship to be super entrenched. Within the NP world, we always say, exclusivity is dangerous, right? So those who are excluded are in danger. Those who are not seen, those who don't have a voice are in danger. And it sounds very simple, and I think it probably lands as quite a logical assumption. I think then what follows is what is the work that can be done, the slow, persistent, creative relentless work that has to be done around removing those obstacles to try and right that power relationship. And it's like anything where, when we haven't been to the gym for a long time and our muscles have stiffened up, we go once and it hurts, so we stop going again, or it doesn't work. We go for a week and don't look like a supermodel, so we stop going. And it's that relentless approach to whatever it is that we're doing, that if we want to see a change, it has to be consistent. So a lot of the work that we do is sort of really looking at starting our orientation, our resources with, again, as I mentioned previously, working with folks who are at community level, who are really feeling impact of violence, and starting with having them explore what they're already doing to protect themselves. We really talk a lot, and we really recognize collectively, globally around the world, this is true in the US and other places, is that in most cases, help is not coming from the outside. There's always this sort of sense that we hope help is on the way. Somebody will come and help us, whether it's sort of very in a suburban domestic environment where we're hoping it's going to be the police, or an ambulance service, to something more dramatic, a peacekeeping force, and so on and so forth. And when we look at the needs for civilian protection, violence reduction, as compared to what help is available out there, they don't even come close to matching up. So help is not on the way. So the most impactful strategies is how to help us all be able to, within our area, be able to protect ourselves, protect each other, address conflict prevention and conflict management without the use of weapons, without the use of force. And even in a place, that places such as Sudan, South Sudan, where they've had long-term, buffeted by the powers that are around them, exposures to violence, is that if you can sort of really invest in what are effectively islands of stability, right? Eventually, what we're working at is a patchwork of community safety, a patchwork of safety that will join up against itself. And I think we have to be very sensitive and aware that we become easily sort of paralyzed in the complexity, looking at the complexity of a situation, and move to the if we can't fix everything, we can't fix anything. And so really the strategies that I have found that are most effective are those that are humble and accepting, that it's a bit by bit, a bite by bite approach, and that the thing that works the best is something that is driven by those who are most at the center of what's happening.
I love the term invest in islands of stability, because I think about examples like Minneapolis. The story that wasn't told was about what did not happen during the George Floyd trials. It was because of groups like Cynthia's and Nonviolent Peaceforce, I know, was in Minneapolis also, and there are many others, and Cynthia can name them better than I can. But there are centers across the country in the United States that are holding their own in these ways. And I think of this and often describe it as sort of the unique difference in the US landscape. And I don't think it has risen to the surface in the ways that we would like. So what you have is the recognition, to your point about working at the local level, working with humility and working persistently. These are centers. There are both community mediation centers as well as bridge building organizations that are working in communities across the country now. And there has been, there was in trying to keep up with each one of these networks, I used to get frustrated with, oh my God, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one, because we have to track all of these. We have to keep in touch with all of them so that we are building the connective tissue between all of them, until I realized one day, that is really silly. You should be celebrating. You should be celebrating that the number of networks and groups that are working at the community level, at the state level, at the regional level, at the national level, are growing to the point where what we hope is that before the events that we expect to unfold in the next few months in the United States, like our elections, like the return of campus life to colleges, which has also played a major role in some of the dynamics that many of us as peace-building organizations have been dealing with, that all of these organizations and networks can continue to grow in such a way that they are connected. Because what I learned from a lot of the peace building work around the world is that, as you said, the help is not coming from the outside. It's not like there are 5 other countries waiting to say, okay, US, we will come in and rescue you. We are the rescuer in most of these instances, right? Whether they need rescuing or not, that's been the US's role. And so the fact that community-based organizations and networks working at the local level, deeply rooted in community, connected to the systems within their own community, are getting activated, are getting small amounts of support, I see as extraordinarily hope-inducing. And I'm not sure that that rises to the level of notice. So I'm gonna share one slide, and I think open the floor for questions and comments, because I know there are practitioners from across the country who are working in these contexts that might be able to share what you're doing, might have questions and observations that will let this conversation continue further. And maybe I'll come back to that. So while I look for it, Cynthia, maybe we can open the floor for questions.
Yeah, the chat is currently open. So if you have questions for Prabha or Tiffany, or you want to share something about your organization or what you're doing locally, please put it in chat. If we have time, we might be able to call on one of you to speak to that. Otherwise, I will be reviewing it. So thank you.
So what I also know, there are some questions and comments about, there's one that I will just address because it's a direct message. I'm not sure about the person wanting to keep it that way. So I will speak to this person's support for a nonviolent approach, and that it seems we need some spiritual, not necessarily religious, but from within one's own heart to end violence and sow the seeds locally and the ripple effects. Gandhi read the Sermon on the Mount, and there are, we hope, many such Gandhis in cities across the United States and the world. But since we are focused on the US, my adopted country at this point, India just finished its elections. They were relatively nonviolent. They ended with some unexpected results. Whatever side one is on, I am grateful that it ended with as little violence as was involved in those elections. And my hope is that there's a prevalence of that kind of spirit at the local level. And we'll be doing, just so for those of you who are working in the US, I also want to share that we'll be doing a lot of work in the next few months. Our recent Department of Justice grant allows us to focus on 10 cities, in addition to the 35, in addition to the 25 that are Trust Plus centers across the country. There are 10 cities where we are piloting a community-based, civil society-based early warning platform, developing an app that will result in an app that can be used by people who sign up to be part of the civil society platform, who will generate the kinds of reports that I know, Tiffany, you've seen in other parts of the world. So I wonder if you can also speak to the role of early warning platforms.
Right. I was just going to ask you a bit more about that. Yeah. I mean, we do a lot of work in early warning, early response. And I think that what we have, when we started getting involved in that in various locations, it was really in reaction to noticing that the concept of early warning, early response was not new. There had been a lot of investment made in early warning, early response platforms. And what often was the challenge, or why they weren't as effective as they could be, is they were pitched quite high. So they were, and by high I mean sort of, they were pitched at sort of at least at a municipal, but usually at a state or national and often a regional level. And so sort of within the humanitarian sphere, within the space that we were working in largely at that time, it was the comparator was always Rwanda. So Rwanda was the genocide that was the most recent in people's mind at the time. And so the early warning, early response networks were really set up around like, oh, let's not let that happen again. Now, the challenge is that the most often reality was there was a lot of focus on how do we gather indicators? What are viable indicators? Who's going to verify? How many people or how many bodies get to receive this information before action happens? And so the challenge comes is that the investment is on the early warning side of it, and there's not enough investment in the early response, and early being the key to an effective response if you want to de-escalate. So if you take a situation like Rwanda, they did not go from zero to genocide overnight. That's what it felt like to those of us who had never heard of Rwanda before, until it showed up on the evening news when something very, very terrible was happening. But that had been generations and generations of a buildup. So hundreds, if not thousands, of opportunities for interventions had been missed or had not been able to take full advantage of. So the work that we've been really working on is it didn't have to look sophisticated. It didn't have to be sexy. It didn't have to be deeply analytical. It had to be really understood and owned by the people who were most aware of the changes of circumstance. So everything from, so when we think about what are indicators of change, it's like, what did people see and feel and hear around them? You know, we had a case recently, a few months ago in Myanmar, where the government, the authorities in Myanmar were about to issue a conscription notice. And what we found out was taxi drivers knew about this before it was public. And the reason they knew is because they were driving wealthy people's fighting age children, sons, to the airport. So all of a sudden they had seen an uptick of young men, 18, 20, 21, 22, from upper middle class and wealthier families being taken out of the country. And they were getting bits and pieces of information. They pulled it all together, and that was a strong indication that they found out that just on the heels of that, the conscription notice was going out. So these are really locally warned indicators. So, you know, we've had success in places, we've got extensive early warning, early response networks in South Sudan, where help is not coming in rural villages, where people are often in a place where fighting is going to happen during the Civil War when the opposition and the government forces were fighting one another. It was all about actually believing that those warning signs were there and then acting to get out of the way, and doing so in a coordinated way so that they were out of the way while the fighting happened, and then they were able to come back to their land, usually quite damaged, but at least intact as a family, and healthy and whole.
So that's really important, because as you said, in many of the early warning platforms, so much of the investment is on the warning and not the response. So part of what we have done, which might be helpful for those who are not yet very familiar, is to learn that we spent years building the relationships and using an existing infrastructure. So the National Association has a network of 300 plus community mediation centers, alongside, many other organizations that are working, as I said, emerging bridge building organizations, those that have been working in some locations and not others. But that network has really allowed us to be deep in the community. These are all centers that are embedded in the community and have the capacity to respond. So one of the things one of our chief analyst is Madhva Palihapitiya, who comes from Sri Lanka. So Madhva's first early warning, early response platform development experience was coming out of that civil conflict in Sri Lanka. And his firm belief is this very pithy way he has of speaking about it. When you say, what does it actually mean? What he speaks to is, it's the, here, let me find his quote. It's a good early warning system is in, where is it? The ability to provide providing the right information at the right time to the right people in the right format for the right action. So that when we are gathering this information, that we are also able to share it with people who are able to take the kind of preventive action that you're talking about. And that's what the Trust Networks platform looks like. And I, again, invite all of you who are working in the United States to reach out. Jennifer's going to put some of those links in there, but I do want to get to a couple of the comments. Thank you, Rebecca. ICRD is doing amazing work. That's another international organization that has also been working in the US on depolarization initiatives and capacity building. And Rebecca's question is, what can we learn from how toxic polarization is manifesting in other countries? What should we be or could we be doing in the US? Any thoughts on that, Tiffany?
On polarization?
Yeah, on depolarization.
One of my thoughts is, and I shared this with Prabha before, is, NP, Nonviolent Peaceforce, is a nonpartisan organization. And the place that we have the most difficulty speaking about that is, of all the countries that we work in, including the Ukraine, which was invaded by another country, is the US. It's the place where that language, it does not resonate well with folks, and that has become increasingly so. And that really speaks to this issue around polarization and this very strong sense of, as I said earlier, that the more threatened we feel, the more we entrench ourselves into our identities. So we're checking out the identity of the other person and whatever those identities that are important to us before we feel like we can have a conversation. And I hear a lot of conversations where everything is quite binary. So whether it's about things related to pop culture, are you a Rolling Stones or a Beatles fan? You have to be one or the other. Do you like Prince or Michael Jackson? Do you have to be one or the other? I mean, those are silly examples that kind of takes the sting out of the political nature. But what we recognize is, between sort of the reality of this situation, the prevalence of our online life, which has deepened, and we're algorithmically siloed into separate groups, and don't know it. It's really difficult. I don't have an easy answer for polarization. From an efforts point of view, is to really try and to do everything. It's a whole spectrum of activities, but sort of it's about creating a space for a tolerance of a range of opinions and a range of approaches to things. Again, it sounds very simplistic, but it is really what we have lost sight of, with everything within our personal life to in the political space.
Well, it seems like, thank Prabha and Tiffany, it seems like we got like 5 minutes or so. This seems like there's like three categories. One is around militarization of policing and the training. The other one is basically language about, what language should we be using to deflate or de-escalate the hate speech or the polarization. And then the third one is, how do we get involved in creating that locally? So however you'd like to take those.
I would like to speak to a little bit of what's going on in the US. I will say that there are growing numbers of organizations that are actually focused on converting, and the term Lisa Broderick uses at Police to Peace is converting police officers to peace officers. Because so many times we talk about, we recognize that a security sector response alone is not adequate. I mean, there was an upswing in police departments locally and statewide, sheriff's offices, all of them getting heavily armed up. And at the same time, what we also know is that community-oriented policing is extraordinarily effective, has been effective in the transformation in many communities around the world. So interestingly, there is, both through the Department of Justice and through the Department of Homeland Security, funding that is supporting a little bit more of an investment in transforming some of the police departments in this country. And I would say, if you look at that website, and I'll see if I can find a couple of the others from the CP3 grants to share a little bit about what's happening nationally to work with police departments. Ultimately, I will say, I don't think it is just training police officers. People have heard me say that is only one step in a much larger process of reimagining what safety looks like. In fact, I think there's a great example of a local mediation center and a police department that now respond to calls together, recognizing that many of the calls about domestic violence and other family and community-focused violence require not a police officer, but maybe a social worker, maybe a mediator, maybe a dispute resolution practitioner, a facilitator. So that particular program, DG, if you're here, maybe you can share some information or a link about that if you're aware of it. Those are examples of what's happening at the local community level. So that's just a big picture of what's happening in terms of the police departments in this country. At the same time, there is a real push because the fear-based messages at the national level continue to bombard us. The algorithms continue to divide us into our bubbles. So what it requires is concerted, concentrated effort on our parts as individuals to ensure that we build a robust, multi-perspective news source. And for that, I would say that there is another great resource. Go to Citizen Connect, and on that website, you will find everyday activities that each one of us can get involved in to build the muscle for depolarization, for thinking beyond binaries. What can we do to exercise that? And you'll find events in which you can participate. I mean, I could go on with a list of organizations that are doing this work. Citizen Connect is one of them. All Sides is a news source. So if you don't want algorithms dictating what news feed you get, make sure you go to the sources at All Sides that do a beautiful job of describing where on the political spectrum any particular news article falls, so that you can assure yourself of a wide range of that kind of news. So the political is one, the personal is another. What was the third section, Cynthia? About what's happening specifically locally. So one of the things that has happened in the US, and I want to end on this, my comments at least on this positive note, which is that there is a tremendous effort across the country. And this one image that I will share is just one of many, and hopefully we will have more of these maps. But what you can see are the centers across the country that each one of them represents a local coalition. And this is just one network. There are about 25 other networks like this across the country, and we will share more of these resources at the Trust Network. So the Bridge Alliance is a network of democracy and structural reform actors. The Bridging Movement has another 500 different organizations. The 22nd Century Initiative has a few hundred organizations, 500 of whom showed up at the conference. Braver Angels is doing depolarizing work, and they have over 10,000 members across the country. So there are literally in your community organizations that are doing this work every day, and I would encourage everyone to get involved in these efforts.
Well, thank you so much, Prabha and Tiffany, for sharing your insight. I have posted in the chat links to all of our organizations, and then also email. If you want to get in touch with people, please go to info@rjca-inc.org. So that's in the chat, and then I can make sure that you can get connected. And locally and wherever you're at, we can try to get you connected. So the Trust Network's there, the Mediators, Beyond Borders International, Nonviolent Peaceforce, MinPeace, Minnesota Peace Building Leadership Institute, RJCA. So, and there's other things in there, Citizen Connect. There's so many people working hard. And like Prabha said, under the radar, so much stuff is happening. People are working. We need to spread the word about what is happening and the things that because so often we're just focused on the negative events and like, how do we respond to that negative event that already happened? But we've done so much work, I know, locally with our communities and saying, how do we come together? And we need to celebrate that. So don't forget to celebrate what's already happening, and the small steps turn into big steps. So So thank you again, Prabha and Tiffany, for sharing this time with all of us. And thank you all of you for coming. One question was, will this recording be available? And if so, where would it be?
It will be sent to all of those who registered. And if we can make it available, otherwise we will let you know. Ben usually follows up. Jennifer might follow up with a message within a couple of days as soon as we've finished editing it just to make it look clean and presentable. You will all get the recording. Jennifer, is there anything you want to add? I'm sorry that we didn't leave more than a minute for Jennifer to share a little bit about what might.
No, I don't want to keep us over. Thank you all so much for joining us, though.
Great. Well, thank you, Cynthia, for the opportunity. This has been great. It's not we get to feel positive about all the work that's going on.
Yes, and I also want to thank Kelly, who's part of Nonviolent Peaceforce, who thought of this project and helped coordinate it. So thank you, Kelly, who's also on the call.